Good morning, everyone. And let me also extend my welcome for joining us here at the 36th Annual FAA Forecast Conference. Today, I'll be going through our 20 years worth of aviation activity forecasts. 20 years goes out to 2031. My presentation today will begin with a brief review of what we saw in 2010. Then I'll lay out the key assumptions that underpin our forecast before going into more details on the forecast numbers themselves. To wrap things up, I'll talk a bit about some of the risks that we see to the forecast and leave you with a few key takeaways. Looking back at 2010, I think we can say it was a good year, at least collectively, for the airlines. Traffic rebounded with revenue passenger miles growing just over 2% and passengers growing just over 1%. Breaking the 80% barrier for the first time, load factor continues to climb, up 2.1 points for the year. A 0.5% drop in capacity led to pricing strength with yields in both domestic and international markets up for the year. Yield, though, has yet to return to its pre-recession levels. The commercial air carrier industry collectively earned a net profit of $3 billion, with passenger carriers earning $1.7 billion. Continued capacity discipline, higher airfares, and growing ancillary revenues lifted the passenger carriers to their first net profit since 2007. Air traffic activity in terms of operations were mixed. Towered airport operations fell for the third straight year, down 3.2% versus 2009, as declines in non-commercial activity were sharper than those in commercial activity. En route air traffic activity was up for the first time in 3 years, up 0.5%. General aviation activity climbed 3.4%, and commercial activity was flat. Before I go any further, I want to point out that the FAA does not independently forecast macroeconomic variables. We purchase these forecasts from commercial services, and what you'll see here are from Global Insight. Also, unless otherwise noted, our forecasts are on a fiscal year basis going from October through September. One of the key assumptions driving this year's forecast is that economic growth and consumer spending in the U.S. will be sluggish over the next few years. Although a recovery is underway and fears of a double-dip recession have resided, high levels of unemployment persist and are projected to remain for a number of years to come. Globally, a two-track recovery appears to be underway, with the economies of the Latin and Pacific regions enjoying dynamic growth, while the economies of the U.S. and Europe show relatively slow growth. Our forecast assumes that oil prices will be flat in 2011 at $74 per barrel and will rise $7 in 2012. After 2012, oil prices gradually increase over the course of the forecast, and by the end are about 1.5 times 2010 levels. While oil prices currently are running around $90, well above our forecast, it's important to remember that the forecast you see is an average for the full year, and we know that oil prices can swing significantly built into the forecast. We don't know in what form future consolidation may occur, but we do believe that consolidation will not have a material impact on the overall level of demand in the long run. We believe that the effects of future consolidation are much more likely to be felt at specific locations and for a relatively short duration, rather than on a national scale for an extended period of time. Our final key assumption is that the forecast we're releasing today is a demand-driven forecast based primarily on econometric modeling and is therefore unconstrained. We assume future demand will not be materially impacted by infrastructure or environmental constraints. Here is a picture of the economic growth that I alluded to earlier. Our passenger forecasts are driven by forecasts of GDP for each of the world regions. Over the course of the forecast, world GDP grows at 3.3% per year. The more mature economies of the US and Europe are growing more slowly than the world average, while the less developed countries of Asia and Latin America are growing much faster. In the next series of charts, our current base forecast is depicted by the thick blue line and last year's forecast by the red line. Looking at unemployment, we see that it peaked in 2010 and that the worst of it is behind us. But the forecast assumes it will be another decade before unemployment returns to pre-crisis levels. We've also incorporated pessimistic and optimistic cases represented by the lighter and darker thin blue lines. In the optimistic scenario with faster growth, the unemployment rate averages 0.4 points lower than the base. The pessimistic scenario, which is characterized by slower growth, unemployment rate averages 0.3 points higher than the base. So why is this important? Employment and unemployment are one of the major drivers of air travel, and the forecasted rate of recovery limits how fast our forecast recovers. This year's forecast of oil prices follows a path similar to last year's forecast, but averages about $6 more per barrel on an annual basis. In the baseline forecast, the price of oil measured by refiners' acquisition cost rises to just under $100 a barrel in 2018, then remains around that level through 2026 until gradually increasing to $113 by 2031. We know that recent prices have been above the forecast of $74 for the entire year. The question is the recent uptick in prices a short-term run-up or a long-term trend? Take a look at how prices spiked and then fell so rapidly in 2008. In the optimistic scenario, supplies are plentiful and prices are about $11 lower than in the baseline by the end of the forecast. Note that the gap in price between the base and pessimistic scenario is much wider than between the base and the optimistic. In the pessimistic scenario, supplies are squeezed and prices more than double by 2031 to land at just under $160 per barrel, more than $40 higher than the base case. Now we turn to our FAA Aviation specific forecasts. The big news here is that over the forecast period, U.S. airline traffic measured in revenue passenger miles more than doubles, increasing from 787 billion in 2010 to just over 1.7 trillion in 2031. Comparing this year's forecast to last year's, the average annual growth rate in traffic is about the same. However, this year's forecast calls for much stronger traffic growth through the mid-years of the forecast, with slower growth in the out years. In 2011, our traffic forecast is strong, calling for growth of 4.9%, followed by fairly moderate increases of 4.5% per year for the 2012 to 16 period. Over the whole period, the average growth is 3.8% per year. In the alternative scenarios, traffic demand projections vary plus or minus 0.7 points from the baseline. In the optimistic scenario, lower fuel prices and stronger economic expansion drive growth of 4.3% per year. The converse is true in the pessimistic scenario. Slower economic growth and higher energy prices lead to slower growth in traffic, averaging just 3.1% a year over the whole forecast horizon. By 2031, traffic in the optimistic scenario is 15% higher than the base case, while in the pessimistic scenario, traffic is 13% lower than the base case. If we look at the composition of traffic, we find that the majority of it's flown in mainline domestic and in international markets. In 2010, mainline domestic RPMs, in red here, accounted for 61% of all RPMs flown, followed by international markets, shown in blue, which accounted for 29%. The remaining 10% of traffic was flown by regional carriers in domestic markets, shown here in white. By 2031, less barriers to competition made possible by open skies agreements and joint alliances increases the share of RPMs flown in international markets sharply, up over 8 percentage points to a share of 38%. Over the same period, the share of traffic flown by regional carriers increases about 1 point, while mainline domestic traffic share drops 9 points to 52%. Turning to our passenger enplanement forecasts, overall, again, the average annual growth rate between last year's forecast and this year's forecast are similar. However, like our traffic forecast, this year's forecast calls for faster growth through the mid-years. More specifically, in 2011, our forecast calls for passenger growth of 3.5%, followed by increases that average 3.6% a year from 2012 to 16. Over the entire forecast period, system passengers grow an average of 2.8% a year, reaching 1 billion by 2021 and just under 1.3 billion by 2031, an increase of 560 million from today's levels. In the optimistic scenario, stronger economic expansion propels passenger demand growth of 3.3% per year, a full 0.5 percentage point higher than in the baseline forecast. As a result, the 1 billion passenger mark moves 2 years earlier than the baseline forecast, and by 2031, passengers in the optimistic scenario exceed 1.4 billion. In the pessimistic scenario, slower economic growth and higher energy prices lead to slower growth in passengers, averaging just under 2.3% a year over the whole forecast time horizon. The 1 billion passenger mark is not achieved until 2024, 3 full years later than in the baseline forecast. If we look at the composition of passenger enplanements, we find that the majority of passengers right now are carried by mainline carriers in domestic markets, as shown here in red. In 2010, this carrier group posted a decline for the third straight year, down 0.7% from 2009. Although the largest component of passenger demand, it's projected to grow the most slowly over the next 20 years, increasing 2.4% per year. The next largest component of passenger enplanements is carried by regional carriers, shown here in the white. This group of carriers posted strong passenger growth in 2010, up 5%. Over the forecast period, we see regional carrier passenger enplanements growing 2.8% per year, increasing from 162 million last year to 291 million by 2031. The smallest component of passenger enplanements, international, shown here in blue, is also projected to be the fastest growing during this forecast. Similar to regional carriers, U.S. carrier international passengers showed strong growth in 2010, up 5.2%. We're projecting a growth of 7.8% this year, with growth thereafter averaging 4.3% a year. Led by its dynamic economies, the Pacific region is forecast to achieve the fastest growth at 5% a year, followed by the Latin region, 4.8%, and the most mature market at the Atlantic at 3.7%. Planes continue to be full from front to back. When it comes to load factor, we're constantly amazed by how high the levels are and how they keep moving upward. Last year, we projected that load factor would rise 1.6 points in 2010, but it was actually up by more than 2 points. This year, we see load factor increasing 1 point over the next 4 years, and then growing slowly the remainder of the forecast to 83.7% in 2031. Increasingly sophisticated booking systems help the carriers to better match capacity to demand. As I mentioned earlier, one of the big reasons why passenger carriers posted their first profit since 2007 was a sharp rebound in yield. Going forward, we see domestic real yield, that's inflation adjusted, continuing to recover from the 2009 downturn with a bump up in 2011 and 2012. For this year, we see a solid increase in mainline carrier domestic real yield, up 2%, with more modest growth for 2012, up 1.3%, driven by a growing economy and strengthening demand. For the remainder of the forecast, real yield is falling at 0.9% per year as competition between the carriers, a growing low-cost carrier share, and technology gains keep price increases in check. By 2031, mainline carrier domestic real yield is forecast to be 12.7% lower than in 2010. The long-run decline in real yield that we're projecting is less than what the industry has experienced during the past decades. During the previous decade, from 2000 to 2010, a period fraught with airline losses, real yield fell at an average of 3.5% per year. In contrast, the decade 1990 to 2000, which was the most profitable era for the industry since deregulation, real yield still was falling at an average of 1.3% per year. Here we're saying 0.9% per year on average through the next 2 decades because we don't think those historic declines are sustainable. We ran the optimistic and pessimistic scenarios, and the bands fall here pretty symmetrically, as you would expect. Next is our forecast of international passengers traveling between the U.S. and other world regions. This is on both U.S. and foreign flag carriers. The slides I showed earlier included travel on U.S. flag carriers only. The blue bars show this year's forecast, and the red bars show last year's. On a total basis, passengers are forecast to grow an average of 4.5% a year. As we mentioned, the dynamic economies of the Latin and Pacific countries drive passenger growth in these markets to be faster than total growth. Conversely, the more mature economies of the US, Europe, and Canada drive passenger growth in the Atlantic and transborder markets to be slower than overall international passenger growth. During the forecast period, the Latin market will surpass the Atlantic as the international market with the largest market share. Touching briefly on our forecast for cargo traffic, it's important to note that the air cargo industry is tied very closely to the overall health of the economy. Thus, when the economy is growing, so does the cargo industry. With last year's rebound in the economy, preliminary estimates show that air cargo traffic increased 15%, with domestic RTMs up 8% and international RTMs up almost 21%. In domestic markets, despite steady growth in the U.S. economy over the forecast period, the nature of cargo demand results in modest long-term growth rates of 2.8% a year, with a return to 07 levels not seen until 2015. International RTMs are growing almost twice as fast as domestic, increasing at a rate of 5.5% a year, and will triple by 2031. Adding it all up, overall cargo demand for U.S. carriers is projected to increase an average of 4.7% a year over the course of the forecast, with total RTMs just over 93 billion by 2031. Turning now to general aviation. For GA fleet and activity, we're reliant on a voluntary survey we conduct every year. The most recent results are from calendar year 09. The survey provides us with a baseline for active aircraft and their utilization. Looking at the composition of the current and future GA active fleet, we see that by far the largest sector is the piston fleet, shown here in yellow, totaling almost 161,000 in 09. Growth in this sector is essentially flat over the course of the forecast time horizon. The average age of the existing piston fleet is quite old. We expect fleet retirements to exceed new deliveries until 2026, and then the fleet size will increase modestly. For the entire period, the piston fleet is projected to increase just 0.2% a year. Experimental, light sport, and others, shown here in white, are not nearly as large a group as pistons, totaling just under 37,000 units in 09, but they're projected to grow much faster, 1.7% a year, over the course of the forecast. The smallest component, the turbine fleet, shown here in red, is projected to grow the fastest, increasing an average of 3% a year over the forecast, with the turbine jet portion increasing 4.2% a year. A growing economy and rising corporate profits lead to a rebound in the demand for business jets and turboprop aircraft. Turning to hours, the 2009 GA survey data reported that hours flown in 2009 were down 15% from 2007 levels. The economic slowdown and continued high fuel prices reduced utilization to historic lows. Indications are that hours flown in 2010 reversed the downward trend of the past couple of years, rising 1.2%, propelled primarily by increases in turbine hours. Going forward, we project that hours flown will increase slightly in 2011, up 1%, before rebounding sharply between 2012 and 2013 at 3% a year average growth. The rebound in hours flown is because we believe that the utilization rates we saw in 2009 were an aberration. As the economy recovers and fuel price increases moderate, utilization rates for GA aircraft should return to what we've seen historically. By 2014, growth reverts to more gradual rates, averaging 2.2% a year for the balance of the forecast. By 2031, total GA flight hours are projected to total 37.8 million, a 57% increase overall from 2010. If we look at the composition of GA flight hours, we find again that currently the largest component is piston aircraft. In 2010, we estimate that piston aircraft accounted for 59% of all GA hours flown. Going forward, piston aircraft hours are projected to increase more slowly, just under 1% a year, as a slowly growing fleet coupled with only modest increases in utilization lead to the slow growth in hours. By the end, they will be less than half of total hours. The experimental, light sport, and other category is currently the smallest component of hours, accounting for 7.2% flown in 2010. We're projecting a healthy growth in hours flown for these types over the forecast horizon, up 3.3% a year on average, with the drivers being the increase in the size of the fleet coupled with modest increases in utilization. The turbine aircraft category accounted for 34% of the GA hours flown. A moderate increase is projected for this year, up 3%, with substantial increases in hours flown projected for 2012 and 2013, up an average of 8% each year, as we believe that with a recovering economy, utilization rates for these aircraft will increase sharply. Thereafter, the combination of a rapidly growing fleet and modest increases in utilization result in steady increases in hours flown. Over the course of the forecast, we project that turbine aircraft hours flown will increase an average of 3.7% a year, and by the end of the forecast period, they will be the largest component of GA hours flown, accounting for 46% of hours flown by 2031. How does all this increase in airline traffic and GA activity translate into operations? Here we see our en route forecast for traffic handled by FAA en route air traffic control centers. In the near term, we see a modest increase in aircraft handled, followed by steady growth averaging 2.3% a year for the entire forecast period. By 2031, en route aircraft handled is projected to total 65.4 million, 61% higher than in 2010. Looking at the composition of en route activity, you can see that commercial activity, primarily airlines, in the red here, makes up 76.5% of all en route activity in 2010. Looking forward, commercial en route activity is projected to grow faster than non-commercial activity, 2.6% per year for commercial versus 1% a year for the non-commercial, driven by the growth in airline traffic. So far, everything I've talked about is from a single top-down national perspective. But when you look at the activity spread across airports, there's distinctly different patterns of activity and growth depending on the size of the airport. As you can see, the growth in passengers by hub size is not shared equally. Looking at the column for the 29 large hubs, you can see that the bulk of air passengers traveling to, from, and through these airports, the bulk of the passengers are traveling through these airports. In 2010, 70% of the passengers flowed through the large hubs, 19% flowed through the 36 medium hubs, and just 10% flowed through the 445 small and non-hub airports with FAA and Contract Tower Control Service. Over the forecast period, we're projecting that concentration of demand will only increase as total passengers at large hub airports are forecast to increase the most, up 80% over 20 years. Passengers at the medium hubs will increase 67%, and a 61% increase in passengers is forecast for the small hubs. By the end of the forecast, the large hub airports represent a 72% share of passengers. When we translate the passenger forecast to operations, the concentration is similar for commercial activity, but very different for non-commercial activity. For us, commercial activity, shown here in red, is the sum of air carrier and commuter air taxi operations, while non-commercial activity is general aviation and military operations. The large hubs are projected to have the largest increase in operations, increasing 61% between 2010 and 2030. The overwhelming majority of the operations at these facilities are commercial, shown in red again, and they're driven primarily by the substantial forecast increases in air carrier traffic. The medium hubs, which are also driven by commercial operations, are forecast to grow 40% in operations. Small and non-hubs, up 22% between 2010 and 2030, are projected to have the smallest overall increase in the number of operations. Activity at these facilities are much more driven by the slower forecast increases in general aviation as opposed to airline traffic. Across the whole 510 total airports with FAA and contract control towers, activity has fallen in total for the past few years, driven by skyrocketing fuel prices and a recession that reduced air travel demand. Going forward, we see an overall increase in towered operations, with a short decline in 2011 driven by declines in non-commercial activity. Here we've broken down the composition of the tower operations between commercial and non-commercial. In 2010, commercial activity totaled 22.1 million operations, or 43% of all tower activity. With growing passenger volumes and slowly rising load factors, commercial operations are projected to increase an average of 2.1% a year over the course of the forecast. By 2031, are 54% higher than 2010. Non-commercial operations at FAA and contract towers make up the majority of operations, 57% in 2010. The slow growth in low-end GA activity, coupled with our assumption of no growth in military, results in relatively slow growth in non-commercial operations, averaging 0.9% a year over the course of the forecast. By 2031, non-commercial operations are projected to total 35.5 million, 51% of total operations at FAA and contract towers. Before wrapping up, I want to highlight some of the major risks and uncertainties we see. Some risks to our forecasts are overarching and always present, for example, a major act of terrorism or a pandemic. But the risks I'm highlighting here are most likely to materially impact our demand forecast. Our first risk is energy prices. Oil prices were considerably higher in 2010 than in 2009, and there's considerable uncertainty as to the level of prices once the economic recovery is on firmer ground. Our forecast assumes oil does not approach $100 a barrel until 2018 and is only at $113 by the end of the forecast, as supply and demand stay pretty much in place. A second risk is the economy. While we're assuming a relatively modest recovery, a more vigorous rebound could occur, and if it does, we would expect faster growth in traffic and most likely operations, which could exacerbate congestion issues. What if growth is slower? A slower economy will reduce demand for corporate and leisure travel, leading to a less profitable, or worse yet, an unprofitable industry. Another risk is that we assume carriers will continue to show restraint in adding capacity. Historically, this hasn't been the case. Typically, carriers have added capacity as demand recovers. We do think it will be different this time, though. While carriers have equipment scheduled to be delivered over the next few years, most of it is for replacement, not for growth. If carriers add capacity more rapidly than we expect, we could see more traffic and operations and additional financial pressure on the industry. Our fourth risk is congestion. Although activity at most U.S. airports fell in 2010, as demand recovers and activity increases, congestion and delays could become a critical limit to growth at certain airports during the forecast period. Airline consolidation is another area of uncertainty. While there's little scope for further consolidation among the major network carriers, there's been some buzz surrounding consolidation in the low-cost sector. Overall, we believe consolidation will not, in the long run, impact demand at the national level. But the risk is that consolidation may result in a less competitive industry with higher airfares and thus lower demand, especially at the local level. However, it's just possible that with consolidation, the industry might be more financially stable and able to support long-term growth in the economy with fewer disruptions. Finally, there are concerns that aviation's impact on the environment could restrict the ability of the aviation sector to grow. Since the problem of climate change is a global one and not a local one, it can be difficult to reach consensus on what are the important goals and how to reach them. Furthermore, the path forward requires multiple solutions in areas such as aircraft technology, alternative fuels, air traffic management, and market-based measures. While there's progress in all of these areas, it's occurring at varying rates and to varying degrees of success. How it will all turn out and how successful we will be and to what degree the solutions to this issue impact aviation is unclear. In summary, a few key points. The industry will continue its recovery in 2011, driven by growing demand for air travel as the economy strengthens. It should be noted that by historic standards, the recovery in demand is modest, as high unemployment continues to constrain consumer spending on all levels, including air travel. Over the long run, we project substantial growth in both demand and activity. We're forecasting that in 20 years, an additional 560 million passengers will be flying on U.S. airlines both here and abroad, resulting in traffic more than doubling. The increase in the demand for air travel is a principal driver between the forecast increases in operations. By 2031, we expect that tower operations will be 35% higher than current levels, and aircraft handled will be 61% higher. However, there are a number of significant risks to the forecast that are clear and present. As I discussed earlier, energy prices may be higher and may be more volatile than we've assumed. While the economy appears to be on track, growth may be lower than we assume, leading to a reduced demand for air travel and fewer budgetary resources. A third risk is congestion. Our forecasts are demand-driven, and there's a risk that capacity at already congested airports will not keep up with projected demand increases. Airline consolidation is a two-edged sword. It may lead to less capacity and higher fares, which is good for airline profitability, but not necessarily for consumers. And last but not least is climate change and aviation's impact on the environment. These concerns could potentially restrict the ability of the aviation sector to grow to meet national economic and mobility needs.